I have been studying innovation for approximately 12 years. I thought it was going to be a 12-week deal. 12 years later, I found out it is extremely complex. Okay? I've studied it in these 6 disciplines. The ones that have a check mark to the left, those are ones that I have presentations on. One of them is the evolution of the surfboard, the industry of flight of the Voyager I did here in my first Tech Talk, military weapons last year, warship evolution. Today's talk is innovation in medicine. Notice, please, the red exclamation point. The reason why that is there is this is the toughest talk of them all. Not on me, on you. So brace yourself. We're going to leave jet contrails here and move on. So how many people feel lucky today? I'm going to try and give away $100. I got a $100 bill right here. And for people out in the audience that are watching it on cable, there it is, right? So this one is much more preferable than the next one. All you have to do is name everybody, identify their picture on the next slide in 10 seconds, okay? You ready? It's like 7 or 8 people. All you have to do is name them. So, here we go. You ready? Boom. 1, 2, 3. Okay, we give up. Okay, so there's 7 people here. How about $50 for 6? Anybody want to go for 6? Okay. $20 for 5. $10 for 4. $5 for 3. All right, I'm going to make it easy. I have a golden dollar coin here. And anybody name one? Okay, come on.
I'll take a Hippocrates guess.
I won't do it to you, but I'll give you the buck for at least trying. Okay, all right. The answer is, these are the guys. That's who they are. That's what they did. And in many respects, we are in large measure indebted to them because if they had not succeeded, if they had not innovated, we might not even be here. Our parents, our grandparents, our lineage back for a couple hundred years. These are largely great guys. We're going to go through each of them, what they did, and when we get done with talking about them, we are 85% done in time, and we are 60% done with our slides. Let's see how we're going to fix that. So let's move on. What you're looking at here is an actual page out of one of the greatest books ever published in medicine. This was published in, I think, in 1543 by Andreas Vesalius, and it turned the corner in medicine to verifiable fact anatomy, fact-based anatomy, and this is the man. This guy was incredible. He was born in 1514, and back then, medicine anatomy studies had not changed for 1,500 years. It proceeded under the teachings of Galen, who was a Greek working in the Roman army. And he was considered infallible. I mean, it was word. He said it, that's the way it was. 1533, Andreas Vesalius goes to the University of Paris, and he's absolutely enamored with dissection. So he's out digging up bodies in the cemetery. He's cutting bodies down of the criminals that hung up to crucify were rotting, fighting wild dogs for him. And he brings these carcasses home to his dorm room. Think about it, right? How'd you like to have a dorm room like that? So there are a lot of rote dissections going on. The way they taught dissection in these universities was there were 3 people. There was a teacher reading out of Galen's book. There was a cutter who was actually performing the dissection, and then there was a guy that was demonstrating and pointing things out, like that's the stomach, that's an intestine, that's an eardrum, that kind of stuff. And 1537, he goes to University of Padua. He gets a PhD in anatomy, and he becomes a department head. Now notice his former advisor, Jacobus Silvus, because we're going to see him on the next slide. That was back in Paris. So he starts giving, he is so enamored with dissection, he gives his own demonstrations by himself. He's a one-man show. People come for hundreds of miles to watch this guy. He is good and very popular. And one day he's dissecting a Barbary ape, and he discovers a nerve complex in a Barbary ape that Galen describes as being a human one, but he had never seen. And he figures it out. Galen had dissected cows, dogs, horses, cats, you name it. No people. He says, oh, what an opportunity. I can fix this. So he sits down, he writes his book, he corrects 200 errors. How was it received? Well, his old advisor writes a letter to the king talking about him producing nothing but error-ridden filth. Right? Treason, violent mendacity to question Galen. To say that it worked out poorly would be an understatement. Okay? Punish him severely, worst example of ignorance, ingratitude, error. Oh man, whew. You know, that's pretty heated stuff here. Who could have known that telling the truth would exact this kind of a reaction? I'm personally shocked. So, they even argue that human bodies had changed since Galen had looked at them. Silvus? What was Silvus? And what was his opinions? They were the highest paid person's opinion in the room, the hippo. And I've seen some of your executives talk about hippos and how to kill them. Like, so, anyway, what happened? Vesalius gathers his books up in the square and tortures them. Incredible, invaluable research and comments and annotations, things like that. Tortures it. He leaves to become a physician to a king. And after doing that, he discovers that the king is a slob. The royal court doesn't like him because they're Galen fans. And life is really tough because the king doesn't listen to him. He likes him, but he doesn't listen to him. So he goes back and he petitions for his old job back in Padua on a crusade to the Holy Land. And he's over in the Holy Lands and he discovers that he has the position. So he starts on his way back to Italy from Israel. But he saves a nickel and he takes a pilgrim ship, which is not very good and gets caught in a storm and it flounders around for weeks and finally they shipwreck on a Greek island. He barely crawls onto the beach alive. He dies a few days later. Nobody knows who he is. They're going to feed his body to the animals. And a passing king says, or captain says, oh, I know who this guy is. This guy's the dude. So they give him a nice burial. It's unmarked. He is forgotten. Into Vesalius. No change for about 100 years. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Innovation 101. Okay, so move on to the next topic, scurvy. Scurvy is an absolutely disgusting disease. It was an occupational disease and for sailors and for people that were on marginal nutrition or eating regimes. If you ever had a scar, it turns out scars seal up with collagen. And when you get scurvy, the collagen dissolves and your scars start opening up again and bleeding. Your teeth fall out. Your gums swell to over your teeth. They turn brown. You can smell people's breath from 30, 40, 50 feet away. You know, the tongues turn black and people just crawl behind barrels on ships and die. It's an increasing problem because they had started longer and longer ship journeys and it became a larger problem as these things are. Now, the ships were absolutely filthy, and a lot of them, particularly the French ones, there was vomit, there's raw sewage down in the bottom, you name it, you know, rotten food. The diet for the crews was absolutely wretched. They didn't mind the larvae in the biscuits. It was when the larvae turned into very bitter beetles. That's what really got them. So the food they had was absolutely wretched. They get copper cooking pots. If the food was acidic, they get copper poisoning, and on and on and on. Example, Vasco da Gama, 1497. Goes to India from Africa, makes it just fine, ignores the warning to coming back, and instead of taking 34 days to get back, it takes him 134 days. 60% of his crew rots on the vine. Dead. Boom, just throw them over into the let sharks get them. Okay. In 1601, the good news here is Sir James Lancaster figures out, he does a clinical experiment, 3 ships, one of them, his ship, has lemons. And he feeds lemons to his guys, and they're all A-OK, and then he has to take people off his ship and put them on the other because they're dying so fast that they cannot even man them. So 1601, Scurvy figured out lemons barricade you against it. Unfortunately, that lesson is neglected. It gets diluted and it gets forgotten. So bad in 1740, was that 140 years later, Sir Anson goes on his round the world voyage, 90% of his 2,000 crew die. It's so bad they have to take a ship, completely abandon it, and burn it out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean because there's nobody there to do it. Now, these ships require 2,000 oak trees to build. Now, these are capital ships, very expensive. So, in essence, it's just threatening Britain's national security, plus the fact the French had more powerful gunpowder. So, 1747, James Lind does another controlled experiment, and 6 treatments. One of them was citrus, and then a bunch of other ones that we know today were ridiculous. And he rediscovers, hey, citrus is the answer. But he writes it up on 2 pages in a 454-page document. It's diluted, it's forgotten, and it's washed away. Plus, there's a guy over here named Sir John Pringle who reports back on Captain Cook had good response with malted wort, sort of like a beer, which is absolutely false because he was grinding an axe here, and so he falsely reported to the Royal Society. So all of this stuff got slimed, and tens of thousands of people died because of this guy. Now, it also got complicated because Lind said, hey, if a little lemon juice is good, concentrating it will be really good. Unfortunately, concentrating it breaks down the ascorbic acid, which we call vitamin C, and whatever little is left rots anyway, and he was doing it in copper pots, and it was acidic, and it was causing copper poisoning, and on and on and on. I mean, these poor sailors, not that they were people you want living next door to you, but this is the guy that fixes it. Sir Gilbert Blaine, he actually captures a French ship down in the Caribbean full of lemons, and he eats them, and he says, oh, this is it. And so he pushes it through, all right? 1795, that's 195 years after it was discovered first. The British mandates it. And make a long story short, 264 years before it became standard practice to give lemons. Part of the problem was they said, hey, these lemons are expensive. Let's save a nickel and use West Indies limes. West Indies limes are great. They're citrus, but they only have 1/4 of the ascorbic acid content. Therefore, scurvy, citrus, didn't work. 1932, they figure out it's vitamin C and it gets isolated. All right, next topic, smallpox. You're looking at a woman who is deathly ill with smallpox. I can assure you, I hope she's married before she got it. Because when this gets done with her, there's nobody even going to want to look at her. And that's the way it was. I believe that I got this off of Larry Brilliant, your former executive, this number off Larry Brilliant, your former executive of Google.org, executive director. In the 1900s, 500,000 people died of smallpox. It's now, and Larry Brilliant, by the way, was one of the guys that actually exterminated smallpox. The way it works is 30% fatality rate, 70% live. Of that 70%, 30% are blind permanently, right? So you got off lucky, 50-50 chance, if you were only grotesquely maimed. That's that one you won, if you're only maimed. If you're blind, that's a big problem, particularly back in the 1800s. And if you're dead, well, you really got a problem. The problem is this stuff here that's on her face sloughs off and is infectious for 1.5 years. So it would go through in waves through communities, and then it would refire back up when new populations had children. So what they discovered, and I say they, is probably the Chinese. They discovered that, wait a minute, there's really severe smallpox, and there's not so severe smallpox, but whatever you get, when you get it, you never get it again. So they sat and they thought about it. A lot of really good stuff happened in China back in the 1100s and everything. He said, look, let's deliberately give people the less dangerous one, and that will give them immunity. So they had this deal where they would take these scabs and they would sniff them up their nose, or they would slip them under the skin, called variolation, and deliberately give people smallpox. And they would get a localized infection. We have a picture of it in a slide. And really worked. So hey, 1700, there's 400,000 deaths per year going on in Europe with smallpox. This is serious problem. So here we go. These are papers that are in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. I actually got these. This is published in 1714. Talks about this. Hey, give them a minor version of it, right? And here's one that was more authoritative, but it's written in Latin in 1716. So now everybody in London knows how to barricade people against the ravages of smallpox. Can anybody guess what happened? What changed? Anybody guess? That's right. Nothing changed, right? Until this woman came along. And if you've got nieces or if you've got daughters or whatever, this woman is a role model. This woman was an absolute firebrand in her day. She'd gotten smallpox and it had absolutely maimed her face and corroded her eyebrows off and everything else, and she knew. She was the wife of the ambassador in Constantinople for Britain. And she found out about this. She took her son down or her daughter down and got them inoculated. And she writes back to England. I wouldn't mind, bringing this back and really being an advocate and a champion for it. Except I don't know any doctors that want to lose their revenue stream for this cruddy treatment that they give when people have smallpox. I mean, it was a money machine. It was an evergreen industry. People dying all the time. Well, she comes back and she pushes in 1721. She gets the king and queen to conduct a test in a prison, and it is successful. King and queen get their children inoculated, and by the way, kings and queens had died of smallpox, resulting in revolutions and throne overthrows and turmoil. So it was a big deal. The problem was that there was resistance to this now. I said, hey, this is God's gift. And other people said, really? What about God's will? Like maybe God wants these people to die and you're intervening. Like, what are you people doing? You don't have the right to do this. No, these people are heathens over there in Constantinople. They don't go to our church. And what are their credentials? So they, it was just like, we're not going to do this. Plus, there were collateral epidemics because there were incompetent inoculations. People were didn't understand that they can cross-contaminate their needles, so people were giving people very strong cases of smallpox. Plus, some of the people had syphilis, and you get syphilis all across the town. Tuberculosis. Slowly, it got adopted, and when it got adopted, what the doctor said, okay, here's another evergreen industry. Let's mutate what we got. So what they did is they brought them in for 2 weeks. They bled them extensively until they were, within, 3 inches away from death. They gave them diuretics and everything, for clean out their intestinal tract, made them eat vegetables, and just about when they're ready to die, then they did it to them. And that was good. In American colonies had read about these philosophical transaction reports, and in fact, in the Boston epidemic in 1721, they were actually doing this. And the slaves, by the way, knew about this from Africa because they had been doing it for a long time. So 1706, it was described to Cotton Mather, and he writes a paper about it. Along comes Edward Jenner now. Inoculation is in full bloom, meaning you're getting a full case of smallpox, but it's just a minor version of it. And he had been inoculated as an orphan, and it absolutely terrified him. I mean, it just left him mentally damaged almost. And in 1761, he becomes a physician's apprentice, and he's out wandering around the countryside, and a milkmaid says, oh, I can't get smallpox because I've had cowpox. And he goes, what? So he goes in and he studies it. About 12 years later, he's identified the cowpox strain. It turns out cowpox is a bunch of different diseases, but there's one particular one that if you get it on, typically these milk women would get it on their hands, and they get this big yawing sore, big draining sore on their hands. Boy, when they got that, they were really happy. because they knew, you know, I'm not going to get smallpox. And so he identifies it, and he actually goes and starts advocating it. He becomes an evangelist for it, and they basically tell him to shut up, because they've known about this for years. Hey, shut up, it's folklore, you know, like, go away. He says, but yeah, if we give these people cowpox instead of smallpox, everybody will be happy, because it's just a big yawning sore. That's all it is. So they threaten to kick him out of medical societies, but he actually does it. And he does one test, it works, and he says, Eureka! He writes it up, he sends it to the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and they say, no. And guess what? They're right. Because it turns out that the kid that he tested it on might have been naturally immune to smallpox anyway, for some reason, didn't know. So like, you need to do a big field test, you know, like one case here. So he's told, hey, don't risk your reputation because they like you here, you're a member, so don't, you know, like, don't compromise it, and they brush him off. 1798, he goes in, by 1798, he does a whole bunch of bogus tests, and one of the patients actually dies in the middle of them. And he publishes this paper, and lightning strikes, kaboom, and it goes off. And now the inoculation clinics, the guys that are, you know, the evergreen industry, the bleeding and the clergy, they start complaining because A, it's quicker, faster, cheaper, more effective, and everything else. So he gets slimed by doctors, and it turns out that there are very serious errors in his paper, very, very serious errors. But no big deal. And in 1840, finally, inoculation of the real stuff is banned, and everybody moves into vaccination. This is a vaccination. That is a inoculation. Right? This is cowpox material. That is smallpox material ingested. Quite a difference. Here's some of the ridicule that he faced. This is an actual cartoon right out of Wikipedia. Right? If you look, you can see cows popping out of people's necks and mouths and legs and stuff like that. So he was getting slimed and a lot of ridicule. But what's interesting is it turns out with any great discovery, it is very rare that the person that gets all the credit really, really did all of the first work. Here is priority here. There was a guy in 1765, 31 years earlier, that had written a paper about this, submitted to the Royal Transaction Society, rejected. Out of hand. Okay. 1769, over in Germany, a guy. Here are 6 known ones here, and the one that looks to be the most authoritative is a fellow by the name of Benjamin Jesty. There's a book about it, absolutely beautiful book, written by Patrick J. Mead, titled Vaccination Rediscovered. And this guy did it 22 years before Jenner. And when the neighbors found out about it, they rode him out of town. They just hounded him mercilessly about doing it. So, and then finally, there's in 1791, there's a fellow by the name of Peter Platt, who 8 years before did it, actually reported it to a university, and it was rejected. So, yeah, there you have it. Precedent is very tough. Next subject, childbed fever. Does anybody know what childbed fever is? Does anybody? All right, you know what it is. Yeah. Okay, we got one person who knows what childbed fever is. Childbed fever is an affliction that struck women in the 1800s and generally killed them within 3 days. It was an excruciating death. Happened right after childbirth. It was a mystery. And of course, this was the day that where everybody thought diseases came from bad smells and stuff like that. There was no concept of germs or microbes or anything like that. So it was just miserable. Now, when you go into a hospital, this is an actual long excerpt out of a book. The doctors wore felt coats. They bought one when they became a doctor, and they retired the felt coat when they retired. They never washed it. It was stiff with gunk, dried blood, goo, you name it, pus, it was all there. And the more crap you had on your coat, the more credentialed you were as a doctor. Literally, you could, in Vienna, go to dinner and know when a doctor was sitting 2 tables away because you could smell it on their hands. They were doing it. Here. So incredible, incredible epidemics of gangrene would go through wards because they were washing amputations with gray, slimy water that had what we now know is like streptococcus in it, causing blood poisoning and massive infections and 100% death rates in some wards. So in 1789, this fellow, Dr. Alexander Gordon, he's watching this epidemic of childbed fever go through this town, Aberdeen, Scotland, and he notices that it seems to follow certain midwives. And if this midwife attended a woman that had childbed fever, the next patient, 70% chance they were going to get it. And so he goes and he says, wait a minute, it's the attending physicians and the midwives that are causing this infection to perpetrate. And he makes a mistake. He writes a report and he names the midwives by name. And what do? They put them on a pole and they run them out of town. They say, who the hell, who are you? This isn't fact. And so, anyway, he names the midwives, he gets run out of town, boom, lost opportunity then. 1840, a guy in Finland, he writes, an invisible and undetectable poison is transmitted during examination of patients. Guess who was examining? The doctors. 1843, Oliver Wendell Holmes over here in the United States, he puts 2 and 2 together and he says, man, he writes this paper, The Contagiousness of Puerperal Fever. You should read the pushback in the medical journals on this one. And 2 guys fought back and physicians went after him. One of them claiming that physicians are gentlemen and gentlemen have clean hands and so therefore they can't be doing this. And so in his rebuttal to that one, he says, okay, let's take a look at this guy. And by the way, the next 8 women died. So it can be done. Well, Google talks about data-based analysis, right? Data-steeped analysis. This guy, Ignaz Semmelweis, he's a guy who's passion bordering on fanaticism. You do not trifle with this guy lightly. He is Hungarian. He's coarse. He doesn't even speak Hungarian very well, and certainly doesn't speak German. Worth a hoot. He's over in Vienna, and he is in the Vienna General Hospital maternity ward. As an assistant in 1846. And he notices there are 2 obstetrics clinics here where children are delivered. One of them is populated by medical students, and this is the death rate. The other one is with midwives. Does anybody notice anything? Like, this line is always above this line. He goes, how can this be? He serves meals at the same time. When they changed the sheets, which was probably, like every 3 months, despite the fact that they had to crack them off the mattresses because they were stuck with pots of blood and things like that. Changed the sheets at the same time. Everything was the same. Opened the windows at the same time. The clergy came in at the same time. Guess what? No change. And then what happens is one of his friends is doing an autopsy on one of these dead women, and he gets a nicked finger, and he's dead a week later with precisely the same symptoms as these women. And he figures it out. The doctors are taking dead material from these cadavers and putting it, inoculating it, injecting it in these living women in their examinations. And you could smell them. These guys would come right from autopsies and go and deliver children and do obstetrics examinations and things. And they were inoculating, they were killing these women. These women knew that there was a problem with this ward. They wanted to have their babies in the muddy streets and alleys of Vienna rather than wind up in this ward here. So, he says, the way we fix this, the way we barricade women together, is we get this stench of death off people's hands. And we wash in chlorinated water. We call it Clorox today. So they wash in chlorinated water, instituted, boom. There it is. Guess what? The doctors resented it. Who was this coarse Hungarian coming in to tell these ultra-sophisticated knowledgeable, svelte, smooth-speaking Viennese doctors what to do. They fired him. Guess what? He leaves, hand washing stops, boom, in the wrong direction. Women start dying, 20% death rate, you know? So he deduces it. It's not renewed. He goes to Budapest. He does the same thing at a hospital there. And note the name here, Rokas Hospital. You'll see it in the epilogue. Right? Right? 0.85. Vienna is 10 to 15%. So it's like 16% higher, 16 times higher over there. Publishes a book. He rants against the medical establishment, calls them killers. He suffers acute dementia. He is tricked into inspecting an insane asylum, but they're actually admitting him. And he gets left there. And about a week later, he's dead. And the story was that he showed up with a nicked finger like his buddy. And very tragically and ironically, he died of an infection from the thing that he was trying to prevent. We'll get back to him. Okay? He was right for the wrong reason. This was the right reason. Turns out that childbed fever is a massive streptococcus infection. Streptococcus is not a bacteria, it is a family of bacteria. And Louis Pasteur had discovered all of this kind of stuff. He was fighting the same problem in Paris, where there was a 100% death rate in an outboard obstetrics clinic, which everybody called the House of Crime. 10 women would go in, you know, and then 10 women would go out in coffins about 8 days later. Right? And he supposedly said this in a debate. Now, I actually have an English translation of the transcript of this debate. I don't find it in there, but it's representative of what he was up against. The doctors did not believe him. They still subscribed to this miasma theory of bad wind and odors and things like that. But it gets adopted in 1890. And now they have the mantra. They have the recipe. If you're sick, find the microbe and kill the microbe, the patient will get better. So that's it for disease, right? By the way, he had zero medical credibility, Louis Pasteur. Does anybody know why? He was a chemist. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't know a big toe from an appendix. You know, what's this guy doing, right? Where are his credentials? So, seek the microbe. So now we have the answer. Microbe theory. You get sick, you kill the microbe. Got it. Here's what I've been able to find in the literature about microbes being foreshadowed. We talk about precedence again. Goes back to 116 BC, right? Certain minute creatures float in the air, enter the body, serious disease, tiny germs propagating. These are literal quotes coming in. And Leeuwenhoek himself, 1676, was looking at bacteria under his microscope, his animalcules and things like that. Next topic, Pellagra. Now, we know what the mantra is now. So when this disease began to sweep through the southern United States, they were looking for the germ. Now, in the 15th and 16th century, the conquistadors arrived in the New World, right? And there were whole regions subsisting on corn-based food. Corn-based, that was it. That's what they ate, right? And that was their food staple. They said, hey, this stuff's really good. High productivity, lots of energy, boom, grows well. Let's take it to Europe. So they take it over to Europe and they start planting it. In 1730, they start getting reports of this weird disease called Pellagra. They call it Pellagra. Okay. In 1900, massive crop failures in the southern United States, and this epidemic ensues. And so all of these conditions are hypothesized as to, as being, causal agents, right? Uncured corn, these guys live bad lives. But here, thank goodness for, oh boy, thank goodness for Pasteur, because we're going to be looking for the microorganism. And so the big search now goes for the microorganism. No progress. Surgeon General really starts getting concerned about all of this, and so he gets Joseph Goldberger, who was in Detroit and just solved a major diphtheria epidemic problem. Turned out it was political corruption and ineptitude on a health guy. He solved it in 1914. He says, get down south and solve this Pellagra problem. This is, this is really bad. So he goes down, he looks at it, he says, wait a minute, these people are eating cornmeal, molasses, and pork fat. That's it. That's their diet. How many ways can you cook cornmeal? There's fritters, and there's this, and there's that, and cornbread, things like that. He says, this is not a microbe disease. This is a dietary deficiency. What are you people thinking, right? They said no. And why did they say no? This was a completely socially unacceptable diagnosis. Anybody know why? The answer was the Civil War had concluded, what, about, 30, 40 years earlier? And where was this guy from? He was from Yankee Town. He's one of them Yankees. And what, we're not, we lost the Civil War, but we won the War of Reconstruction, by golly. And we're not listening to this stuff from Washington, D.C., the guys that sent those armies down and marched to Sherman, Sherman's march and all. No way. This dude is bogus. So they reject it. Well, so he does an orphanage experiment where there's Pellagra rampant in an orphanage. He goes in and gives these little kids good diet. Bam! Cures them. So what? Doesn't mean anything, right? So then he goes to a prison farm where they have good food, and he says, look, I'll make a deal. You guys get out if you do my test. 90 days, you get out. They say, okay. So he puts them on the cornbread and molasses and pork fat diet, and time goes on, and time goes on, and time goes on, and on day 89, first case of Pellagra shows up. Week later, bam, everybody's got it. He comes in, he gives them their original diet, bam, everybody's cured, everybody's released. Of course, that doesn't mean anything, does it? Absolutely not. So he says, okay, you guys looking for microbes? What we'll do. So he goes to wards where there are Pellagra cases, and he gets mucus, fecal material, saliva, skin scrapings, you name it. And he puts it in capsules, and he holds filth parties where he and his friends and their family members ingest those capsules. Right? Guess what? Nobody gets sick. No microbe. My goodness. So, 1937, they figured out it is a niacin deficiency. Read your cereal boxes, vitamin B3. So the question is why didn't American Indians get sick? If it was why didn't they do it? Here's why. Because they didn't like the hulls on the corn kernels. And so they took water and they poured it through fireplace ashes, and that put calcium hydroxide, into the water. And when they soaked it, it broke the vitamin B3 loose out of combination with that kept it from being digested, right? And that was it. So the conquistadors got the corn, but they didn't get the recipe. They didn't get the methodology. Why was the lesson of dietary deficiency forgotten when it had been settled, 150 years earlier with scurvy? Beats me. Because they were on a mania on microbes. So, we're almost out of time. How are we doing here? Oh my goodness. Okay, just as I said, we're 45 minutes into the presentation, almost out of time, and we got a whole bunch more slides to go. So this is where you get to work. Nobody's going to be sending emails like this wonderful guy over here, okay? I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Per slide, you're going to read them. I will not be reading these slides out loud. So, here we go. Our first one. These guys here all have opinions. Here we go. Richard Hooker. Take that to the bank. Machiavelli. The great American patriot, Thomas Paine. Nobel Prize for Literature, Maurice Maeterlinck. the great Jewish rabbi, Moses Maimonides. This next one, if you follow any one of these people, this is the one. This is the one that Thomas Kuhn read in German, did not understand what he was trying to say for long reason, and based in large measure his scientific revolution book. Okay, ready? Ludwig Fleck, My Privilege. Notice there's no mention of correctness in this statement. And then we got our good friend, Mr. Paul Sappho. Great observation. So, we're in the epilogue now. People ask me, have we learned our lesson? You know, is it any different now? Now that we've seen all of these catastrophes and failures and everything else like this, don't bet on it. Please. Here's some more examples I didn't even go into. Yellow fever, Carlos Finlay. Told the world for 20 years, mosquito was the infection vector for yellow fever. Ignored. Cuban doctor. Proven by Walter Reed and his crew down in Havana. Okay? Berry, nutritional. Corn, rice, white rice. Ignored. Right? No headway for him. Offered Sommer. I think this man should get a Nobel Prize. He was studying slight night blindness in children, and he went to do a follow-up study, and they couldn't do it because they were dead. And he said, how can this be? And he went in and he discovered that a slight vitamin A deficiency, which caused night blindness, increased the death factor for poorly nourished children by a factor of 3 or 4 over in Africa. So he goes and gets 4-cent vitamin A capsules, gives them to these kids. They are cured of night blindness within like 4 hours. He writes it up. The first rebuttal comes back titled, Too Good to Be True. It wasn't. It was the real deal. Okay? Dr. Berwick. We talked about hand washing, chlorinated lime, and things like that. Right? He's fighting constant uphill battle. Get doctors to wash their hands and share information. Hospitals don't share information because they are competitive advantages. So if you're going to get like a brain scan or something at a hospital, you want to shop around and go to the best one in the area because they don't talk to each other. Right? We got MRSA. Doctors are washing their hands 1/8 as much as they think they are. You've got people going out in scrubs out of hospitals spreading C. diff. Boy, you don't want your intestines to find out about C. diff, let me tell you. So, no, we haven't learned it. Okay. Nonetheless, in 1967, Surgeon General of the United States supposedly made this statement. Time has come to close the book on infectious diseases. We basically wiped out infection in the United States. I haven't been able to verify it, but I looked pretty hard. Well, Stephen Jay Gould, he has some interesting observations that you can just sort of like parse the likelihood of that previous statement. You know, we live in the age of bacteria, and it lives in places we don't even think about, you know, like 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, you know, like, 3,000 feet below the ground, and all of this stuff here, dominant form life. 10% of our dry body weight is made of bacteria, and some of them we cannot live without. So we're walking petri dishes. So we go back to that original statement. Here are the contradictions. HIV, SARS, Ebola, hantavirus, toxic shock syndrome, Lassa fever, West Nile virus. Oh boy, here's avian flu and swine flu and all those forks and everything turned upside down in your cafeterias now, right? Yeah, sure. Okay. Evolving antibiotics, gene reassortment going on in swine flu. Swine flu isn't necessarily past. You go back and research the flu of 1918. Came out mild in the spring, and then it killed, they think 40 million people, maybe 100 million people later that winter. So all these things here, they can all make a resurgence and come back. This is a man you may recognize, Dr. Larry Brewing. He's your former Google.org executive director. Right? We might be entering the age of pandemics. And this guy is the real deal. He was part of the party that annihilated and exterminated smallpox. Incredible man. I did not know about him until I read a Wall Street Journal article about him. So we're going to start into some quotes again. And of course, no conversation is complete without referencing Uncle George. And I think this is, I've got one more. As a competitive advantage, you can almost bet that your competitors will forget something very, very fundamental, like the fact that there are dietary diseases and things like that. In technology, they'll just forget lessons of the past. Napoleon once said, never interrupt the enemy when he's making a mistake. So it's a good strategy. It's one of the reasons why it's not good to talk about a lot of the things that you do, which is what most of you don't talk about, and that's good. Gibson, out of Neuromancer, he wrote Neuromancer. This is out of an NPR interview. Right? What happens is when a precipitous change becomes evident, or the necessity for it, it is not monolithically perceived throughout the universe. And so as a result, you can capitalize on that for a short time. The epilogue. Folks heard about Pasteur and germ theory and all this other stuff, and they say, this rings a bell. And Simo Weiss had been buried in Vienna pretty much in an unmarked grave, but it was marked, and there were about 4 or 5 people there at his funeral, no family, right? They said, this guy's a national hero. Let's go dig him up and bring him back to Budapest. So they build this beautiful, beautiful statue here in front of the hospital where he did. And they rebury him in another cemetery in Budapest. They call him the Savior of Mothers and everything else like that. And that's where they bury him. Well, some enterprising people say, we have an asset. We ought to really monetize this asset. It's a fungible resource, so let's monetize it and blah, 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 blah. His house is just about a mile or so away from here. Let's go fix up his house and bury him there on the grounds. And we can set up hot dog stands and sell curios and things like that, and we can monetize this asset. So they do it. They go clean up the house, and they go to the cemetery. They open up his crypt, get him out, and you're on their way. And they say, you know what? We got him out. Let's X-ray him. Let's X-ray Eggnotz. Okay, so they take him over to the hospital. They shoot a bunch of X-rays, and then they go plant him in his house, where he is now. And they go in and they look at these X-rays. What do you think they find? He didn't die of an infection from a nicked finger. He had a crushed skull, he had broken ribs, he had broken arm, wrists, things like that. He was beaten to death in anonymity. It wasn't anything personal, it's just what they did with people in insane asylums back then. And so this is one of the greatest minds, and this is how it ended. So, good friend Mr. Voltaire. And as Kenny Rogers says, you got to know when to hold them, and you got to know when to fold them. Because innovation is a full contact sport. And some people are out for blood. Just ask Niccolo Machiavelli. Certainly true for Mr. Simo Weiss. And now, one of the greatest engineers. This next slide was tough to get, put together last night. Bob Noyce. Never give up, because innovation is what it's all about. Do not be encumbered by history, but understand that when you step out onto the battlefield, you better be prepared. And it will come, the attacks will come quite often from very surprising places. All right? So you want to be ready for it. If it doesn't show up, and sometimes it doesn't, so much the better. All right? This is a picture out of Carolyn Cadis' book, used with her permission, and this is a wonderful book here that she put out, Portraits of Success, pictures of all of most of the Silicon Valley founders. So this is my bibliography, plus a whole bunch of things that I'm beginning to find now. Thank you, Google, on your book project out of University of Michigan, 1850 books. There's 1827 books that I found on the James Lynn biography. Things that I just absolutely couldn't find 3 years ago are now becoming accessible to me. And I am deeply, deeply thankful that I can repay Google. Here. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for your patience. This has been a tough, tough presentation. That's why it is number 6 in my list of, why it's part 6. It's been a privilege to be here on my Google Third Tech Talk. And I'd love to come back and talk about sports or science or whatever is open. Thank you very much.